Grand Duke Konstantin was the supreme moral symbol of the Russian Empire, but by night he ran an underground network in the slums of St. Petersburg. Rumors claim this double life sparked a royal medical scandal. However, declassified imperial files expose a different reality. The force that ultimately destroyed him was the crushing hypocrisy of his own empire. The answer lies in the flawless, impenetrable architecture of the public facade he constructed. Born in 1858, Grand Duke Konstantin Konstantinovich served as a vital cog in the machinery of the Romanov dynasty. Late 19th century Russia operated on a rigid system of absolutes. The Tsar was ordained by God. The Orthodox Church controlled the spiritual and moral framework of the entire population, and the military enforced the unyielding hierarchy of the state. Konstantin was born into the absolute epicenter of this crushing triad. His bloodline tied him directly to the thrones of Greece, Germany, and Great Britain. To exist in this environment meant functioning under permanent, unforgiving scrutiny. Every public appearance, every spoken word, and every alliance was a matter of state security. The pressure to conform to the Romanov ideal, a masculine, martial, and fiercely orthodox figure, was absolute. Any deviation constituted a direct act of treason against the dynasty's divine mandate. To survive and to carve out the necessary space for his hidden compulsions, Konstantin built a public persona of overwhelming, undeniable perfection. He recognized early on that the most effective place to hide was in plain sight, shielded by layers of unassailable prestige. He did not simply rely on his birthright. He actively cultivated an image that made him untouchable. He became known throughout the empire and across the European continent under his literary pseudonym, K.R. He published volumes of poetry, translated Shakespeare into Russian, and composed plays that were performed in the imperial theaters. This was a calculated and brilliant move. He established himself as an intellectual and artist within state parameters. This move neutralized the brutal expectations of his class and secured the adoration of the Russian intelligentsia. His appointment as the president of the Russian Academy of Sciences cemented this image. He operated as a scholar, a patron of the arts, and a man of profound public intellect. Who would dare suspect the president of the Academy of Sciences, a man who debated literature with the brightest minds of his generation, of prowling the diseased slums for transient sexual encounters with peasants? The intellectual armor was formidable, but the biological and social camouflage he deployed was even more vital. In 1884, Konstantin entered into a dynastic marriage with Princess Elizabeth of Saxe-Altenburg, who took the Orthodox name Elizaveta Mavrikyevna. This union was a highly strategic, socially mandated contract designed to fulfill the paramount duty of any Romanov, the continuation of the bloodline and the projection of domestic stability. Konstantin executed this duty with the same meticulous discipline he applied to his military and academic roles. The marriage produced 9 children. In the eyes of the public, the royal court, and the Orthodox Church, this large, seemingly harmonious family was the ultimate proof of Konstantin's moral rectitude. He was frequently photographed surrounded by his offspring, projecting the image of a stern but loving patriarch. This domestic tableau was the strongest barricade he possessed. The sheer volume of his familial obligations, combined with his exhaustive official duties, created a narrative of a man who simply had no time, nor the inclination, for anything outside the rigid boundaries of state and family. The public saw a Grand Duke exhausted by his service to the Tsar and his dedication to his wife and children. They saw a devout man who attended liturgy with clockwork regularity. This overwhelming accumulation of socially approved behaviors created a blinding halo effect. The Romanov court, the secret police, and the public at large looked at Konstantin and saw exactly what they needed to see: the perfect Russian nobleman. His extreme adherence to the visible rules of his society provided him with the invisible passport required to break them in the dark. The Russian Imperial Army functioned as the structural spine of the autocracy, the primary instrument of state terror, and the ultimate guarantor of Romanov's survival against a rising tide of revolutionary fervor. Within this colossal, unyielding machine, Grand Duke Konstantin held a position of formidable practical authority, the Inspector General of Military Schools. This was not an honorary title or a decorative sinecure handed to a minor royal. It was an active, deeply ingrained administrative role that demanded his constant presence across the vast expanse of the empire. His duties required him to conduct relentless tours of military academies, cadet corps, and provincial garrisons, evaluating the discipline, training, and operational readiness of the next generation of imperial officers. This position provided Konstantin with the most sophisticated, state-sponsored cover imaginable. His frequent unannounced visits to isolated barracks and late-night inspections of cadet dormitories were entirely justified by official mandate. He moved continuously through a closed world of regimented masculinity, surrounded at all times by thousands of young men in uniform. The nature of his office meant that his interactions with subordinate personnel, from the highest-ranking academy directors down to the lowest foot soldiers assigned to menial labor, were completely unquestioned. His presence in the intimate, highly restricted spaces of military life raised no alarms. It was exactly where the Inspector General was supposed to be. However, beneath the polished boots, the brass buttons, and the rigid parades, the elite echelons of the Imperial Russian military harbored a complex, tightly guarded subculture. Decades of historical research into the internal dynamics of the Preobrazhensky, Semyonovsky, and other elite guard regiments reveal a striking paradox. The extreme, hyper-masculine environment of the Imperial Guard coexisted with a deeply entrenched, silently tolerated network of homosexual relationships among the aristocratic officer class. The military establishment did not aggressively seek to eradicate this behavior, nor did the perceived moral decay lead to a breakdown of martial discipline. Instead, the hierarchy managed the situation through a ruthless application of institutional hypocrisy. The military machine operated on an ironclad, unwritten code of silence. The true transgression was the public exposure of the act, rather than the act itself. An officer could maintain intimate relationships with other men indefinitely, provided the affair remained entirely invisible to the civilian population and never compromised the aesthetic dignity of the uniform. If a scandal threatened to break the surface, the military apparatus would move swiftly, not necessarily to punish the moral failing, but to amputate the source of the public embarrassment through forced resignations or quiet reassignments. Within the closed ranks of the regiment, however, these secrets were protected by a fierce, mutual complicity. The officer corps functioned as a fraternity bound by shared privilege and shared transgressions, highly skilled at closing ranks against the outside world. Grand Duke Konstantin navigated this unspoken code with absolute precision, but his royal status fundamentally altered the dynamics of these interactions. He did not engage with his peers within the officer corps as an equal. The power imbalance between a Romanov Grand Duke and a military subordinate was so vast, so heavily weighted by centuries of autocratic conditioning, that it obliterated any conventional understanding of consent. The lower ranks of the Russian military, the cadets, the ordinary soldiers, the orderlies, were brutally drilled into a state of instant, unquestioning submission to rank. To defy an order from a superior officer was a court-martial offense. To refuse a direct approach from a senior member of the imperial family was entirely unthinkable. Konstantin weaponized this structural conditioning to serve his private compulsions. When he selected a young soldier or a cadet during one of his inspection tours, he was issuing an unspoken imperial directive. The men he approached were trapped within a rigid chain of command that demanded their absolute compliance. They possessed no avenue for refusal and no mechanism for complaint. Who would a private soldier report to? The military police were designed to protect the autocracy, not to prosecute its leaders. The Orthodox Church was firmly tethered to the throne. The civil authorities had zero jurisdiction over the royal family. The Grand Duke operated with total impunity, his actions shielded by the crushing, institutionalized silence of the military apparatus. Despite his ability to exploit this system safely, Konstantin remained fundamentally isolated by his own power. He could commandeer the bodies of his subordinates, but his bloodline prevented him from ever truly integrating into the subculture of the officer corps. He was separated from the very men he commanded by an unbridgeable chasm of status and divine right. This acute isolation within his own professional sphere drove his appetites further down the social ladder. The highly controlled, localized encounters within the military academies eventually proved insufficient. The absolute safety provided by the military code of silence emboldened him, pushing him to seek out increasingly anonymous and transactional encounters outside the walls of the barracks. The Inspector General, securely insulated by his rank and the complicity of the armed forces, began to look toward the dark, unregulated corners of the civilian capital to fulfill desires that the military environment could no longer contain. The transition from the rigid hierarchy of the imperial military to the chaotic anonymity of the civilian underworld required a calculated stripping of identity. When the administrative duties of the day concluded and the marble palace grew quiet, Grand Duke Konstantin initiated his descent. He shed the gold-braided uniforms, the epaulettes, and the heavy medals that physically marked him as a ruler of men. Dressed in plain, inconspicuous civilian clothing, he slipped out of his heavily guarded residence and walked into the freezing, fog-choked streets of St. Petersburg. The imperial capital was a city of stark extremes, a glittering facade built upon a foundation of immense human misery. Konstantin bypassed the broad, gaslit avenues of the aristocracy and navigated toward the squalid, overcrowded districts where the working poor struggled to survive the brutal Russian winter. In these darkened alleys, he was no longer the grandson of a czar or the inspector general of military schools. He was simply an anonymous, wealthy gentleman with specific, dangerous appetites and the financial means to satisfy them. The primary destinations were the city's lower-class public bathhouses, the banyas. Unlike the luxurious private bathing clubs frequented by the Russian elite, these public facilities were dark, communal, and highly unsanitary. They were dense, windowless spaces choked with scalding steam, the smell of cheap lye soap, damp birch branches, and the sweat of hundreds of laborers. In late 19th century Russia, the banya was one of the few places where the rigid physical boundaries of class temporarily dissolved in the stifling heat. Men of all backgrounds were stripped of the clothing that defined their social standing. However, Konstantin did not go there to equalize himself with the masses. He went to the banyas because the blinding steam and the transient, chaotic nature of the environment provided the perfect operational cover for illicit sexual commerce. It was a hunting ground completely disconnected from the surveillance of the imperial court. Konstantin's sexual preferences were strictly defined by extreme class disparity. He harbored no desire for the refined, educated aristocrats or the polished officers of his own social stratum. His targets were exclusively drawn from the absolute bottom of the Romanov social pyramid. He sought out the roughest elements of the St. Petersburg working class: off-duty privates, transient factory workers, dockhands, and menial laborers. This preference for rough trade was fundamentally rooted in the mechanics of power. A relationship with a social equal would involve negotiation, emotional entanglement, and the constant, terrifying risk of exposure or blackmail. By targeting men who existed on the edge of starvation, Konstantin guaranteed an entirely transactional dynamic. The immense economic chasm between them ensured that the encounter would be brief, silent, and easily discarded. The Diaries of the Grand Duke provide startlingly specific details regarding these targets, stripping away the anonymity of the masses to reveal individual faces of the St. Petersburg underclass. He frequently documented encounters with a young carriage driver named Yatsko, A coachman in the imperial capital represented the quintessential archetype of working-class survival, a man hardened by physical labor, exposed to the brutal elements, and entirely dependent on the patronage of the wealthy. When Konstantin approached a man like Yatsko in the humid darkness of the banya, there was no pretense of courtship. It was a direct, unvarnished purchase. The Grand Duke was using his inherited wealth to buy temporary, absolute dominion over the body of a man who belonged to a social class that the Romanovs effectively owned. The engine of this underground economy was imperial currency. Konstantin used his vast financial resources to buy both immediate compliance and permanent silence. For a common laborer or a drafted soldier, the amount of money offered by this anonymous, wealthy stranger for a brief sexual encounter often equated to weeks, or even months, of grueling physical labor. The economic coercion was absolute and undeniable. These young men, trapped in a system that offered them no social mobility and constant deprivation, were in no position to refuse. They took the rubles, performed the requested acts in the dark corners of the bathhouses, and vanished back into the slums, asking no questions about the true identity of their patron. The money acted as an iron seal on the transaction, ensuring that the secret remained buried in the desperate poverty of the city's lower depths. The most striking evidence of Konstantin's divided existence is not the physical acts themselves, but the meticulous manner in which he recorded them. After concluding his business in the banyas, he would return through the freezing streets to the safety of the marble palace. Sitting alone in his opulent study, surrounded by volumes of poetry and state documents, he would open his private diaries. He did not record these encounters with the emotional prose of a romantic poet or the chaotic scribbling of a man out of control. Instead, he documented his sexual transgressions with the cold, precise methodology of an imperial bureaucrat compiling a state report. He treated his private life as an administrative ledger. With chilling exactitude, Konstantin recorded the dates of each excursion, the specific bathhouses visited, the names or occupations of the men he paid, and the exact sums of money transferred. Every physical act was catalogued, categorized, and filed away on the page. This obsessive record-keeping reveals a mind deeply conditioned by the bureaucratic machinery of the autocracy. By translating his uncontrollable, chaotic urges into organized data, he attempted to exert a false sense of administrative control over the fractured pieces of his own identity. The diaries were not just a confession. They were a nightly financial audit of his moral corruption, a stark balance sheet where the currency of the Romanov Empire was traded for fleeting moments of physical release in the gutters of the capital. Dawn in St. Petersburg offered no absolution. As the first pale light broke over the freezing waters of the Neva River, illuminating the grand facade of the Marble Palace, the Inspector General locked himself in his private study. The transition from the chaotic, steam-filled underworld to the silent, opulent corridors of his royal residence was jarring and immediate. Sitting at his heavy oak desk, the meticulous bureaucratic ledger of his nightly activities closed. Konstantin faced the crushing reality of the morning. His study was not just a workspace. It was a sanctuary lined with heavy, gilded icons of the Russian Orthodox Church. The faces of the saints stared down at him from the walls, their painted eyes offering no comfort, only severe, unyielding judgment. The scent of cheap lye soap from the banyas was replaced by the heavy, suffocating smell of burning beeswax candles and frankincense. Here, the clinical detachment of his financial record-keeping evaporated, replaced by a visceral, paralyzing terror of eternal damnation. Russian orthodoxy in the late 19th century was not a passive framework of gentle moral suggestions. For a core member of the Romanov dynasty, it was an absolute literal truth that governed the cosmos. The Tsar ruled by divine right, and the royal family was expected to embody the highest spiritual purity of the empire. To sin was not merely a personal failing, it was a betrayal of the divine order. Konstantin believed implicitly in heaven and hell. He believed in a literal, judging God who saw every transaction in the dark, who watched him hand imperial rubles to illiterate carriage drivers, and who recorded every desecration of his aristocratic body. His royal blood, which protected him so flawlessly from the Tsar's secret police and the judgments of the civilian courts, offered absolutely zero protection from the wrath of the Almighty. In the quiet of his study, stripped of his uniforms and his public adulation, he was entirely defenseless against his own faith. His diaries served as both an administrative ledger and a stark confessional. Pages reveal smeared ink, physical evidence of the severe psychological distress he experienced while documenting his actions. Konstantin did not possess the modern vocabulary or the psychological framework to understand his homosexuality as an innate orientation or a natural facet of his identity. He viewed his desires through the strict, punishing lens of his era and his religion. To him, his attractions were a demonic affliction, a grotesque disease of the soul that had invaded his mind. He recorded frantic, agonizing entries where he prostrated himself before the holy relics in his study, pressing his face to the cold floor in desperate prayer. He made ironclad, blood-earnest vows to God, swearing upon his own salvation and the lives of his 9 children that he would never again succumb to his lusts. He would fast, he would pray, and he would purge the sickness from his body through sheer force of spiritual will. These vows were genuine, forged in the fires of intense self-loathing, yet they were ultimately useless against the crushing weight of his compulsion. The diaries document a vicious, unbreakable cycle. The period of frantic repentance would last for a week, sometimes only a few days, or on particularly grueling occasions, mere hours. The psychological tension of denying his fundamental nature within a society that demanded total conformity would build like steam in a sealed iron boiler. The pressure would mount until his willpower fractured completely. Driven by an urge he could neither understand nor control, he would break every sacred oath. He would once again don his plain civilian clothes, slip past the palace guards, and vanish into the freezing fog to seek out the brutal, transient relief of the slums, restarting the deadly loop of sin, self-flagellation, and despair. The physical environment of his transgressions added a layer of lethal jeopardy to his psychological torment. Late 19th century St. Petersburg was an epidemiological nightmare. The lower-class public bathhouses were breeding grounds for fatal pathogens. By seeking out the absolute lowest strata of the urban poor, men who lived in overcrowded, freezing tenements with no access to basic sanitation or medical care, Konstantin threw himself directly into the path of rampant disease. Syphilis, which was entirely incurable and led to a slow, horrifying death through neurological decay, ravaged the capital's underclass. Tuberculosis coated the damp walls of the banyas. Cholera outbreaks routinely swept through the slums. The Grand Duke was rolling the dice with his life, and the life of his wife. Every single night he ventured into the dark, yet the official medical records and the consensus of modern historical analysis present a startling, contradictory reality. Despite decades of reckless exposure in the most dangerous corners of the imperial capital, there is absolutely no evidence that Grand Duke Konstantin ever contracted a sexually transmitted disease. He did not bring syphilis back to the Marble Palace. The pathogens of the St. Petersburg slums seemingly refused to touch the grandson of the Tsar. However, his body was far from healthy. The official medical files document a man who was physically ravaged by chronic, severe asthma. For years, he suffered from debilitating attacks that left him gasping for breath, his lungs seizing up, confining him to his bed for weeks at a time. The public attributed his frail health to the damp, unforgiving climate of the capital and the exhausting burden of his state duties. The true source of his physical deterioration, however, was not a microscopic pathogen caught in the filthy water of a public bathhouse. It was the unrelenting, brutal psychological warfare waged within his own mind. Modern medicine heavily documents the devastating, systemic impact of extreme, chronic stress on the human immune and respiratory systems. Konstantin spent decades living in a state of permanent high-alert terror, terror of public exposure, terror of blackmail, and, most profoundly, terror of eternal hellfire. He was a man suffocating under the colossal weight of his own secrets. His eventual death from heart failure in 1915, at the age of 56, was the mechanical culmination of a body that had simply given out. The machine broke down not from external infection, but from the unbearable internal pressure. The most tangible punishment Konstantin endured was the psychological deterioration of a man who spent his life hiding from the public, only to realize he could never hide from his own rigid faith. The death of Grand Duke Konstantin in June 1915 did not occur in a vacuum. It happened against the backdrop of an empire in the early stages of a catastrophic collapse. Millions of Russian soldiers were being slaughtered on the Eastern Front of the First World War. The economy was fracturing, and the Romanov dynasty was rapidly losing its divine grip on the populace. When Konstantin finally succumbed to heart failure in his private apartments at the Pavlovsk Palace, the immediate concern of the imperial court was not the state of his soul, but the state of his papers. He left behind a massive volume of written material, state correspondence, drafts of poetry, academic treatises, and, critically, the locked leather-bound diaries containing the meticulous, explosive ledgers of his underground sexual transactions in the St. Petersburg slums. A modern observer, accustomed to the panicked destruction of evidence by corrupt politicians, might expect Tsar Nicholas II to order a swift midnight bonfire. They might assume a frantic campaign by the secret police to locate the diaries, burn the pages, and assassinate anyone who knew of their existence. This fundamentally misunderstands the absolute arrogance and rigid bureaucracy of the Romanov machine. There was no panicked cover-up because the autocracy did not operate on fear of the public. It operated on a presumption of eternal, unshakable control. The House of Romanov possessed strict, predetermined administrative protocols for handling the estate of a deceased senior royal. When Konstantin died, a team of imperial clerks, bound by oaths of absolute secrecy and blind obedience, immediately descended upon his private study. They did not read the documents, they simply cataloged the volumes, sealed them in heavy wooden crates, and transferred them to the highly secure imperial archives. The diaries were not destroyed because the Romanovs believed they would rule Russia forever. They viewed the imperial archives as an impenetrable fortress, a closed system accessible only to the Tsar and a handful of trusted officials. In their minds, locking the diaries in a vault was as effective as burning them, but far more orderly. Tsar Nicholas II, who was Konstantin's nephew, likely possessed some level of awareness regarding his uncle's private life. In the insular, paranoid world of the imperial court, rumors circulated, and the secret police kept exhaustive tabs on everyone, including the royal family. However, the Tsar and his ministers practiced a weaponized form of deliberate ignorance. As long as Konstantin had maintained the public dignity of his office, the state did not care about the specifics of his sins. By sealing the diaries in the archives, Nicholas II was simply finalizing the unwritten contract of his empire. The truth would remain permanently buried beneath the administrative weight of the state. This arrogant assumption of eternal rule shattered completely in 1917. The February Revolution forced Nicholas II to abdicate, and by October, the Bolsheviks had seized absolute control of the state apparatus. The Winter Palace was stormed, the Romanovs were violently deposed, and eventually executed in a basement in Yekaterinburg. The new Soviet government inherited an entire empire, including the massive, heavily fortified vaults of the imperial archives. The physical diaries of Grand Duke Konstantin, containing the highly detailed records of a senior royal buying the bodies of desperate laborers, fell directly into the hands of the very revolutionaries who had sworn to destroy the aristocracy. One might expect the Bolsheviks to instantly weaponize these diaries. A public exhibition of Konstantin's secret life, a Grand Duke exploiting the working class for his own sexual gratification, would have been the ultimate piece of anti-Tsarist propaganda. It provided perfect, handwritten proof of the moral rot and extreme hypocrisy of the ruling elite. Yet, the Soviet government did not publish the diaries. The papers vanished into the newly established State Archive of the Russian Federation, GARF, disappearing just as completely under the red flag as they had under the double-headed eagle. The Soviet decision to bury the diaries was driven by a different but equally rigid form of ideological control. As the Soviet Union consolidated power under Joseph Stalin, the state became obsessed with completely sanitizing history. The official Soviet narrative required a specific, heroic depiction of the proletariat and a monolithic, universally evil depiction of the bourgeoisie. The messy, complex reality contained within Konstantin's diaries did not fit this rigid ideological framework. The idea that common laborers and soldiers were willingly participating in a transactional, underground homosexual economy with a Grand Duke contradicted the image of the pure, unbroken Soviet worker. Furthermore, homosexuality itself was aggressively criminalized under Stalin in 1933. The Soviet state wanted to erase the concept of homosexuality entirely from the historical record, viewing it as a disease of bourgeois decadence. To publish Konstantin's diaries would be to admit that this behavior existed extensively within the very capital they now controlled. Consequently, the diaries entered a deep, bureaucratic freeze that lasted for the entire duration of the Cold War. For nearly 80 years, the leather-bound books sat in the dark, climate-controlled silence of the Garf vaults in Moscow. The regime changed, the world map was redrawn, wars were fought, and nuclear arsenals were built. But the meticulous records of the carriage driver Yatsko and the banyas of St. Petersburg remained locked away, protected by the iron grip of Soviet state secrecy. The hypocrisy of the Romanovs was seamlessly protected by the ideological paranoia of the communists. This total historical blackout did not begin to crack until the catastrophic collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The fall of the Iron Curtain triggered an unprecedented, chaotic opening of the Russian state archives. As the old Soviet restrictions dissolved, a new generation of Russian and international historians finally gained access to the forbidden vaults of Garf. In the late 1990s, researchers systematically working through the uncatalogued Romanov papers opened the heavy, dust-covered boxes belonging to the former Inspector General of Military Schools. When they opened the bindings, the ink was still dark and perfectly legible. The tear-stained prayers for absolution, the exact sums of imperial rubles paid for silence, the specific locations of the midnight bathhouses, all of it survived. The absolute control of two brutal consecutive empires had failed to erase the ink. The private torment and systemic exploitation, documented by a man who thought his secrets were safe forever, finally walked out into the light of the modern world. The physical reality of the diaries laid bare on the reading room tables of the State Archive of the Russian Federation was as startling as their contents. These were not the frantic, loose scraps of a man losing his mind, nor were they the coded, heavily guarded notes of a criminal fearing imminent capture. They were heavy, formally bound volumes, maintained with the exacting discipline of a high-ranking state official. For the researchers who first opened them in the late 1990s, the initial shock came from the handwriting itself. This was the unmistakable, elegant script of K.R., the celebrated poet and president of the Imperial Academy of Sciences. It was the same hand that had drafted state decrees, corresponded with Europe's most eminent scholars, and translated the high tragedies of Shakespeare into Russian. Yet, on these pages, that refined script was utilized to record the precise hourly rates of male prostitutes, the architectural layout of the capital's most degraded public bathhouses, and the physical attributes of illiterate teenage conscripts. The immediate reaction within the Russian historical community was explosive and sharply divided. For decades, the post-Soviet cultural revival in Russia had leaned heavily into a nostalgic, idealized resurrection of the Romanov dynasty. The imperial family, brutally murdered by the Bolsheviks, had been recast as martyrs of absolute moral purity. The Russian Orthodox Church was actively moving toward canonizing Tsar Nicholas II and his immediate family. In this climate of historical sanctification, the Diaries of Grand Duke Konstantin acted as a catastrophic disruption. Conservative historians and religious hardliners initially attempted to dismiss the diaries entirely. They launched aggressive campaigns arguing that the documents were elaborate Soviet forgeries, specifically manufactured by the KGB during the Cold War to permanently discredit the royal bloodline. They argued that a man of Konstantin's immense faith, a man whose public poetry was infused with such profound Orthodox devotion, was biologically and spiritually incapable of the acts described in the Garf vaults. These attempts at denial were swiftly dismantled by forensic and archival reality. The diaries seamlessly integrated with the rest of Konstantin's massive, undisputed bureaucratic output. The ink, the paper, the chronological continuity of his daily state appointments, alongside his nightly excursions, provided an airtight, unbreakable chain of evidence. Furthermore, the sheer volume of psychological agony recorded on the pages made the forgery argument absurd. A Soviet intelligence officer tasked with inventing propaganda would have depicted the Grand Duke as a cartoonish, remorseless predator. Instead, the diaries presented a man utterly destroyed by his own conscience. The researchers found pages warped by dried tears containing frantic, hyper-religious pleas to God that were so intimate and agonizing they defied fabrication. The historical establishment was forced to accept the undeniable truth. The absolute pinnacle of imperial Russian morality was, simultaneously, its most prolific patron of the underground homosexual economy. As the contents of the diaries were meticulously transcribed and published, a fierce ethical debate erupted over how to historically categorize the Grand Duke. Modern analysts found themselves grappling with a deeply contradictory figure who demanded a nuanced, unsentimental evaluation. On one side of the debate, historians highlighted the extreme, undeniable, predatory nature of his actions. Konstantin was not merely a victim of 19th-century homophobia. He was a senior architect of the very military and autocratic machine that ground the lower classes into dust. When he handed money to a starving soldier or a desperate coachman in a bathhouse, it was not an exchange between equals. It was an act of extreme exploitation facilitated by an unbridgeable chasm of class and power. The men he purchased had no agency, no legal recourse, and no ability to say no to a member of the ruling dynasty. From this perspective, the diaries are a chilling record of imperial entitlement, proving that the Romanovs believed they literally owned the bodies of their subjects, to be used and discarded at will. Conversely, psychological historians and biographers focused on the profound tragedy of his internal existence. They pointed to the diaries not as a record of conquest, but as an endless, cyclical chronicle of trauma. Konstantin existed in a society that offered him absolute material power, but absolutely no psychological exit. He was trapped in a gilded cage constructed by his bloodline and his faith. He could not abdicate his position. He could not divorce his wife without triggering a state crisis, and he possessed no framework to understand his sexuality as anything other than a demonic infection. His wealth allowed him to act on his compulsions, but his religion ensured that every act was paid for in extreme mental anguish. He was a tyrant to the men he bought, but he was equally a prisoner to the dogmas of his own empire. This duality forces the reader of the diaries into a space of deep discomfort. It is impossible to fully absolve him, given the systemic abuse of his power, yet it is equally impossible not to recognize the sheer, suffocating terror he endured every day of his life. The documents reveal a man who built a perfect, unassailable fortress of public virtue, only to realize that he was locked inside it with his own worst enemy. The archives did not just expose a scandal, they exposed the lethal structural flaw of the autocratic system itself. The Russian Empire demanded a standard of ideological and moral purity that was fundamentally incompatible with human nature. By demanding absolute perfection, the state guaranteed extreme, hidden corruption. Constantine's life proved that when an empire places its honor above the truth, it forces its leaders to become monsters in the dark. The publication of the Diaries did not merely rewrite the biography of a single Romanov. It fundamentally detonated the accepted mythology of the entire late imperial era. For decades, the Romanov dynasty had been portrayed through two mutually exclusive historical lenses: the Soviet lens, which depicted them as cartoonish, bloodthirsty tyrants, or the post-Soviet lens, which sought to elevate them as deeply pious, tragically martyred saints. Constantine's private ledger introduced a devastating third reality. It proved that the empire was not brought down solely by radical political agitators, foreign wars, or economic collapse, but by a rotting, structural hypocrisy embedded at the absolute top of the hierarchy. The Romanovs were running an empire built on unyielding orthodox morality, yet their highest-ranking members were systematically violating those exact laws with total impunity. This was not a localized individual scandal. It was a profound institutional failure. The Diaries demonstrated how the autocracy functioned as a machine designed to protect the image of power at the absolute expense of truth. Consider the specific mechanics of this protection. Constantine was not a rogue actor operating outside the system. He was the system. His ability to move undetected through the slums, to purchase the silence of soldiers, and to file these transactions in an imperial archive without fear of legal reprisal highlights a terrifying reality of autocratic power. The law simply did not apply to the Romanov bloodline. The police, the military courts, and the church were instruments used to control the masses, not to police the rulers. When Constantine paid Yatsko the coachman in the humid darkness of the Banya, he was not just buying a fleeting sexual encounter. He was demonstrating the absolute terrifying ownership the imperial family held over the Russian people. The lower classes were treated as disposable commodities, their bodies available for rent by the same men who would later order them to march into machine gun fire on the Eastern Front. The Diaries provided documentary evidence that the social contract of the Russian Empire was fundamentally broken, exposed as a hollow fraud long before the first shots of the 1917 revolution were ever fired. The cultural impact of these revelations forced a brutal reassessment of Constantine's public legacy. Throughout modern Russia, his poetry is still taught, his plays are analyzed, and his tenure at the Academy of Sciences is widely regarded as a golden era of Russian intellectualism. Yet, every public achievement is now permanently shadowed by the contents of the Garf vaults. When modern audiences read his celebrated poem Prayer, an agonizing plea for spiritual purity, it can no longer be interpreted as the abstract musing of a devout intellect. It must be read as the desperate, literal cry of a man who had just returned from the squalor of a public bathhouse, terrified of the eternal hellfire he believed he had just earned. The Diaries stripped away the polished veneer of his art, revealing the raw, bleeding psychological wounds that actually drove his creativity. His art was not a reflection of his perfection. It was a desperately constructed shield meant to deflect from a corruption he could neither control nor cure. This reassessment extends to the physical monuments of the empire itself. The Marble Palace in St. Petersburg, Constantine's magnificent residence on the banks of the Neva River, stands today as a state museum. Tourists walk through his opulent study, admiring the gilded icons, the heavy oak desk, and the vast library. Yet, the physical space is forever altered by the historical knowledge of what actually occurred within those walls. This was the room where the Inspector General of Military Schools sat in the dead of night, his hands shaking, meticulously recording the names of the men he had bought and the exact amount of imperial currency he had spent. The palace is no longer just a monument to Romanov wealth and architectural triumph. It is a crime scene of psychological torture and systemic exploitation. The architecture of power remains physically intact, but the moral authority it once projected has been completely hollowed out by the handwritten evidence of its former owner. Ultimately, the survival of the Diaries serves as a stark documentary autopsy of an entire political ideology. The Russian Empire utilized a ruthless secret police and a state-sponsored church to curate an image of divine moral superiority, while its highest-ranking members systematically violated those exact laws with total impunity. Konstantin's meticulously bound ledgers, preserved through the fall of the Tsars, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the Cold War, prove that the autocracy functioned as a machine designed to protect power at the absolute expense of truth. The historical record inside the Garf vaults details a society explicitly engineered to facilitate the exploitation of the poor, operating behind a paralyzing facade of royal perfection.